Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today, I want to celebrate this Tag Thursday by doing the fabulous new tag created by Joe and Mary, the Book Buds. Their tag has two different sets of questions, one set for library users and one for non-users. I will definitely be answering the first set for library users. I'm extremely excited about the bonus question especially, which will give me a chance to tell one of my very favorite bookish stories, one that I don't think I've ever shared on this channel. Okay, let's get started. Question number 1. How often do you go to the library? Well, these days I go about once a week. For years, my spouse and son and I would go to the large branch of the county library one evening per week as sort of a family adventure, followed sometimes by a visit to an ice cream shop. Abe and I went to that library or a different one at least once a week during the day as well. The second question, do you belong to more than one library system? I do. The one I go to most frequently these days is the local branch of the county library. Although my branch is pretty big, it doesn't contain every book I'm looking for, and if I request a book from one of the other branches, it often arrives in just a day or two. There's also a really great interlibrary loan system through the county library that tracks down books from both public and university libraries across the country. More on that later. The other library I used to use a lot, which is currently under reconstruction, is my neighborhood library. It's extremely close to my house and therefore most convenient. It's a much smaller library, but it had a really wonderful children's section with a lot of children's books published in much earlier generations, which I loved reading through when my son was young. While the library is being rebuilt, the temporary replacement library is in another location, which is not nearly as convenient for me, especially since I don't drive. But as soon as the real library reopens, I assume I'll be spending time there again too. And a third library I can walk to from my house is a branch of the Washington, D.C. library. But usually, if I want to go to the D.C. library for some reason, I go to the large main branch downtown via subway. Within walking distance, there is also a community college library, and there are many other academic libraries as well as the Library of Congress within the reach of public transportation. Finally, I still belong to a very small library run out of the NIH, the National Institutes for Health, for patients and their families. The library was a fantastic resource when David was inpatient, as well as when he was on campus for radiation treatments or physical therapy or neuro-oncology appointments. With the library's permission, I've kept my card because they have a small number of digital books that are different from the digital books available at my other libraries. Question 3. What % of books do you read from the library? I have no idea. Maybe a quarter. Often I check out books because I want to read one essay or one story from a collection, etc. And that makes it difficult to count. But I'll say a quarter. And another quarter are advanced copies, either from publishers or NetGalley. Another quarter plus are from my shelves. And the final scant quarter are from books I purchase, mostly used. I'm totally making up these numbers. They're just purely impressionistic. The fourth question, do you listen to audiobooks or get ebooks from the library? Or are you hooked on Audible or Amazon or something else? I love checking out both ebooks and audiobooks from both Libby and Hoopla. I know the programs don't work in exactly the same way everywhere, but for my two main libraries, Libby has a limited number of copies, and when all are checked out, users can put them on hold until they become available. Hoopla, on the other hand, seems to allow everyone access to all titles immediately, but each person is limited in how many they can access. Both my county library Hoopla system and my neighborhood library system allow 10 checkouts each, but NIH only allows 1 or 2. I've heard of others that allow 3 or 5 or whatever. Whichever, Hoopla and Libby are fantastic systems. One tip, you can also check out magazines on Libby for free and even get them automatically delivered digitally each time a new issue comes out. I get the New Yorker that way, and also the New York Review of Books. Many libraries, including mine, also give patrons access to other digital resources, including access to a variety of newspapers from around the world. Personally, I find them to be incomplete collections and fairly clunky to use, but although it's a pain in the neck to navigate and hard to read, I've just realized that I can at least sometimes get The Fiction Chronicle by Sam Sachs on there without subscribing to the Wall Street Journal. Question 5. Did you go to storytime at the library as a kid? No, I don't think there was a story time in my library when I was a child, but I used to take my son. A little background. From very early on in my relationship with David, my spouse and I used sign language quite a bit, partly because my deafness in one ear made it hard to understand conversations in loud places, and partly because of my academic work and later my academic position as a professor at a college for deaf students. After we moved to our own quiet apartment, we tended to speak aloud at home, but in restaurants or whatever, we would often choose to sign. Then, our son was born, and while it was clear that he could hear and that he understood our speech, he didn't actually answer aloud. He signed instead, which we didn't quite expect at first, since we had not been teaching him baby signs or anything like that. In fact, this was a couple of years before the big boom in the idea of baby sign. And I didn't know any of the regular ASL signs for basic concepts discussed by young children. One day, Abe started pointing at his toys with his eyebrows raised, trying to get me to tell him the sign for whatever he was pointing to. I had no idea how to sign blocks, or doll, or even train, but I learned. And right before a trip to the zoo, I quickly learned the ASL signs for many of the animals we would see. When we first started going to story time at our local library, Abe could sign fairly well, but still didn't speak. All of the parents there would sit cross-legged on the floor in a circle with young children sitting on their laps. The children's librarian always started the event with a few songs before she read a story. The parents would join in, and many of the kids would as well. Abe often tried to sign the lyrics, which I thought was fascinating. If I started singing aloud, he would act really uncomfortable. Now, to be fair, I am a terrible singer. But what was bothering him, it seemed, was not my lack of ability to carry a tune, but the vibration of my chest against his little back. So I started signing along with him. And then, when he was nearly 3 years old, he suddenly grabbed onto my moving hands one day and held them down. He didn't want me to sign, and he didn't sign himself either. By that point, he had started speaking just a few words, Papa and Mama, broccoli, his favorite food at the time, the name of the dog next door. But within a few weeks of that first day he held my hands down, he was speaking aloud in complex sentences. And within about 8 months or so, he was reading short chapter books to himself. I think story time at the library had something to do with it. One more quick Abe story related to that neighborhood library of ours. A little bit later, the library was the first place we let Abe walk to all by himself. And that remained basically true for several years, I think. He had to cross one super tiny neighborhood road where a crossing guard was stationed because of a nearby school. As long as we chose the correct hours, she would be there to help him across. And then the rest of the way was protected from the road by a picket fence. Because I loved the idea that to aid the library meant freedom and independence, I backed out. While I kept my membership active and went with him whenever he invited me, or sometimes for special events that he wasn't interested in, I let our neighborhood library become his library with his librarians. And I started using the nearby branch of the county library for my own main library. The sixth question: have you ever borrowed a movie or video game from your library? Yes, we used to check out movies on VHS and then on DVD, as well as audiobooks on cassette and then CD in the pre-streaming world. When he was little, my son used to check out one particular VHS tape over and over again, an adaptation of Coot Club, one of the books in the Swallows and Amazon series by Arthur Ransom. My son started watching it in 2004 or so, but the adaptation was made in 1984. He must have checked out that VHS from the library dozens and dozens of times. And I don't think anyone else ever had checked it out before. At some point, a librarian my son knew well, who I'll mention later in a different context, surreptitiously handed Abe a little package wrapped up in newspaper. Here, don't tell anyone, because we're not supposed to set an example of giving patrons resources being removed from circulation. But you should have this. Now I check out digital movies from my library. A few are on Hoopla. My county library also offers the service Canopy, spelled with a K, which has a lot of interesting films. And I can also view most of the great courses through my library resources. If I didn't spend so much of my screen time watching YouTube, I would listen or watch more of those, I think. My son and I loved some of the great courses when he was homeschooling. Number 7, have you ever gotten fined for returning books late? If so, how do you feel about that? Absolutely. I used to be a day or two late, not infrequently. Sometimes I returned books a little late just because I didn't have time to go to the library on a particular day, but often it was because I was not quite finished with something I was enjoying. I never felt guilty about being just a day or two late, and I certainly never begrudged the library for placing the fines. For the last few years, my library has moved away from fines, but also added a few weeks to the maximum checkout period. But in general, I still tend to turn in things within a day or two of when they're expected back. I don't feel like I owe it to the library to return the books promptly. Instead, I feel like I owe it to my fellow readers. Question 8. Do you attend special events, groups, or book sales at the library? I do, although between the pandemic and my own complicated family life over the last few years, I attend events far less frequently. Although I've not been back to a big book sale yet, I do often sort through the racks of donated books that the library sells for 50 cents or $1 or $2, and I not infrequently pick one up. In fact, this morning I found Queen's Play, the second book in Dorothy Dunnan's Lyman Chronicles. I meant to pick up the first in the series, which I think was also there, but I goofed. If it's still there next time I'm at the library, I'll add it to my bag. As for events, I used to attend a monthly discussion of classic novels at my neighborhood library. For a while, many of us from the library and the attached Civic Center got together to work through humanities-oriented MOOCs, those courses that at least used to all be free on Coursera and edX, etc. One of the wildest events I went to, and still go to almost every year, is a holiday performance by our local Morris dancing teams. They celebrate the winter solstice in the fairly large children's room of our otherwise very small little library. The dancers and musicians are adults, but when they're performing at the library, they make slight adjustments to what they say to make it a little more child-friendly. David and I started taking our son Abe to these solstice celebrations when he was tiny, and he loved it so much he decided to dress as a Morris dancer for Halloween one year. A few years later, he decided to apprentice as a team musician. Soon he also started dancing with them and convinced David to join them as well. So every time I go to the children's room, I think about them dancing together. Number 9. Have you ever given or taken a book from a little free library, a book box, or a book swap? Absolutely. I have a few very regular walks. One, my morning walk, which I take for a little exercise and fresh air, down to a lovely little creek, and then along it for a bit before circling back home. When I make the full circle, about an hour's walk, I pass 6 different little free libraries. One of them, where my spouse found the Gertrude Stein I had mentioned a couple of times, is frequently stocked with advanced reading copies of children's books and middle grade books. I think I know who the reviewer is, but I'm not certain. The main shopping part of my neighborhood is about a 10 minutes walk away, and I pass 4 totally different little free libraries on the way. Similarly, when I walk to the nearest subway stop, I pass another 3 libraries. 2 of them are kept especially well stocked with nerdy books. Most recently, I found this study by Jenny Uglow, an author I know because of her biography of Elizabeth Gaskell. The book is about Sarah Losh, someone I'd never heard of, who lived during the Romantic period, and her family was friends with Wordsworth and Coleridge. The book talks about Losh's creation of what Uglow calls the strangest and most magical Victorian church in England. But the book also explores village life at the time, as well as the coming of the railroads and the changes they brought. It may be a while before I can read the book fully, but I'm looking forward to it. Incidentally, right between 2 of the little free libraries on that short walk to the subway is the home of my congressional representative, the amazing Jamie Raskin. I promise at some point to take you on an extended tour and perhaps make a series of short videos where I visit some of these little free libraries and show you what I can find. Okay, now the special bonus question. Does your librarian know you by name? Now this is kind of a long story with 2 big parts. At my neighborhood library, I knew some of the people who worked there, and I knew a few of them totally outside of the library from beforehand, in fact. But at the much larger local branch of the county library, I came to know a few librarians, especially one man named Adam. At first, he knew me and my homeschooling son because we came in so frequently and checked out so many books. He would frequently give us ideas about other books we might enjoy related to whatever we were reading at any given moment. And he teased us a lot. In fact, his style of teasing was remarkably like the kind of teasing I've enjoyed from Steve Donahue. When I first met this librarian, I both had a young child and was writing my first academic book. I couldn't take my preschool son into an academic library. And honestly, many of the books I needed were not held locally anyway, except at the Library of Congress, where I would have to read them on site. So I asked my local librarian if I could request a couple of academic books through interlibrary loan. His face lit up, and he told me that searching for books for interlibrary loan request was one of his very favorite things. I filled out a couple of slips for books I thought he might be able to get easily, and he did. I filled out some more slips, and he repeated that searching for interlibrary loans was one of his very favorite things, but this time he rolled his eyes as he said it. The next time I filled out slips, I decided to make it a bigger challenge, and he came through on almost everything I asked for, even something I had thought would be utterly impossible, since even the Library of Congress no longer had a copy of the booklet. Well, I was incredibly grateful to him, and when my first book was published, I thanked the librarian in the acknowledgments. I'll share it with you. I extend my gratitude to the Montgomery County Public Library's Interlibrary Loan Service and the staff of the Silver Spring branch, especially Adam Green, who dedicated an entire hold shelf to me almost every week. Okay, Now it's time to tag some friends. I will tag Heidi at the channel My Reading Life, Sonia at An Enthusiastic Reader, Elizabeth at Bookwins and Books, Charlotte at Queenie Reads, and Katie at Books and Things. Thank you, Book Buds, for creating this tag, and thanks, Angelia, for tagging me. And thanks to all of you for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.